Smoke signals from around the campfire.
So I'd like to welcome Simon Elmer, who's just published The Road to Fascism, a critique of the global biosecurity state, which basically, he'll explain it, is about a huge rise in state power, I suppose is a fairly good summary, but there's lots of nuances to that. He says, with the lifting of the thousands of regulations by which our lives were ruled for 2 long years, there's been an understandable desire to believe that the coronavirus crisis is over and we will return to something like an albeit new normal. But as new crises have sprung up to take its place, war in the Ukraine, the so-called cost of living crisis, and the return of the environmental crisis, it's increasingly difficult not to look back on lockdown as the first campaign in a war that has not been declared by any government, but is no less real for that. This war represents a revolution in Western capitalism from the neoliberalism under which we've lived for the past 40 years, where it's heading with even greater speed and finality, and which the road to fascism sets out to demonstrate is the new totalitarianism of the global biosecurity state. Not content with one blockbuster book, Simon's just this week alone published 2 more, which hopefully he'll talk about. Virtue and Terror, Selected Articles from the UK Biosecurity State, Volume 1, and The New Normal, Selected Articles on the UK Biosecurity State, Volume 2. So we're going to have a session with Simon introducing the book and probably taking it in other directions for half an hour or so. Then we'll open it up for your questions. If you could have a few prepared, and we'll ask you to raise a digital hand if you'd like to ask something in particular. And there'll also be accents on the positives as well, I hope. What can we do? People are looking for solutions. They're looking for practical ways they can make a difference as they realize what's going on. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Simon. Welcome to the Campfire community.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me along to talk to your organisation. This is the book, if you haven't seen it yet. Pete said that not all of you have read it, or maybe none of you have read it. I'm not going to try and summarise the whole book. I'm going to try and talk about 3 what I think are key points that my book argues, which I think helps us, well, hopefully helps us to understand what is going on. Because I think one of the things that's characterized the last 3 years is the failure of our existing explanatory models, whether that's of politics or of medicine, and now of war, to make any sense of what's going on at the moment. I think that, perhaps I'm speaking out of turn, but everyone seems to be very, very confused about what's going on. And this is sort of my attempt to provide a framework into which to try and understand what's going on, how we got here, what it is that we're actually facing, and what's coming next. Because as Pete said in the introduction, when the biosecurity restrictions that we lived under for 2 years through the extent of the Coronavirus Act 2020, when they were lifted last March, what is that, 22 now, there was a kind of a feeling that that has gone, that's over. It was either a mistake or we overreacted or whatever. And because of what I'd done up to then, the sort of the 24 articles I'd written, I didn't believe for a second that it was over. I thought it was just beginning. And that's why I characterized it in, I think, the passage Pete just read, as the first campaign in a war that's being waged. I started writing the book in February of 2022 of last year. It took me about 8 months to write, which is very quick. And I had a sense when I was writing it that I had to get this finished very, very quickly. It had to be written, published as soon as I could. And I published it at the end of September, which is, 6 months ago now. And I've got this strange feeling my book is already out of date because things are moving so quickly. When I started writing it, it was during that, we were just coming out of that winter of 21-22. And I was looking at the extraordinary level of state violence in places like Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, the kind of the enormous authoritarianism of the vaccine mandates, the gene therapy mandates in places like Austria, where people were going to be fined huge sums of money if they didn't get injected with the whatever was the designated dose, and if they couldn't pay, be taken to jail. In Germany, all across the world. Not so much in this country by then, although we were still sort of getting beaten up on the street when we went out to protest about mandates or lockdowns or so on. So my first question was, what if this isn't fascism, what is it? Now, fascism is a very, very loaded word. And in the 18 months prior to my beginning this book, I had written about 24 articles about what I call the UK biosecurity state. I'll get around to that term in a minute, biosecurity, because it's an interesting one. It's not about medicine, it's about biosecurity. And the shift between those two terms is kind of at the heart of what I want to sort of talk about. And I'd actually written, I don't agree with people who call this fascism. I thought that word was too loaded. I thought it was about something in the historical past. I thought the contingency of the historical forces that created fascism in the 20s and 30s were too particular to that moment. But I've changed my mind about that. When I started to write the book, I wanted to ask a question, not whether this is the return of fascism, although that ended up being sort of one of the titles of my book, but what can historical fascism tell us about what is happening now? And I think there's three aspects of historical fascism which can illuminate what's been going on and what is going on and where we're going next. One of those is biosecurity, because fascist, not all of them, but fascist societies were societies of biosecurity. One of them is the term totalitarianism. Now, not all fascist states were totalitarian, but some were. Obviously, the Third Reich became. And I think, well, the third one is the term fascism itself, which describes, maybe we can talk about this in the conversations, describes a merger between the interests of business, big business, of corporate interests, and of state or government authority. So I want to talk about those three elements in the time I've got and see how they can tell us something about what's been going on and why I think it's legitimate. I increasingly think it's legitimate. And I think a lot more other people, many other people are using this term to talk about the return of fascism as the, if you like, the political economy of Western capitalism at the moment. Okay, biosecurity. It's a funny term. My introduction to it, if you like, was through reading the works of Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, contemporary philosopher, who was one of the few, the very, very few intellectuals, philosophers, theorists who dared to question the sort of the dominant narrative about what was going on. He started writing a sort of a blog in which he released small passages. And I started reading that, but I was familiar with his work from many, many years ago, and I started reading it again. And he writes a lot about this term biosecurity, biopolitics. But it struck me also that on May 2020, so 2 months since the World Health Organization sort of unilaterally declared the pandemic at a time when I think 14 people in the world had their deaths attributed to COVID-19. The Boris Johnson government set up the Joint Biosecurity Centre. That was very obviously, very openly modelled on the Joint Terrorist Analyst Centre, which was set up after, I think, 9/11, or maybe it was 7/7. And it was run from the beginning, it still is run, by people, sort of senior spies from where was it, from GCHQ. I think it's interesting that all the crises which have been manufactured into existence by which we are threatened and which are being used to justify the removal temporarily or on a permanent basis and the fundamental change in our lives, whether that's the health crisis or the environmental crisis or the energy crisis or the cost of living crisis or the geopolitical crisis in the Ukraine, all get turned into health crises. By doing that, when they say, for instance, I mean, the US, we've got it here as well, racism is now seen as a health crisis. Pollution, when Sadiq Khan in London says that pollution is now a health crisis. What it does is it sets up the framework for biopolitics. The term biopolitics originates with the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who introduced this term biopower. And Foucault's concern was with a shift in the nature of power from a pre-modern to a modern period, so kind of around about the time of the French Revolution. He says that power prior to the modern times was the power of the sovereign, that can either be the king or the monarch, or later on the power of parliament to order, if you like, the death of the subject. They can require their death, they can order their death. So it was a power over the life and death of the subjects, of the sovereign over the subjects. Foucault says then we go into the modern period, that changes. Power is not over life and death, or not to order death, it's over the power to regulate, to monitor, and to control our lives. And it struck me, as I imagine it struck all of us, that what happened to us under lockdown when on the justification of a public health crisis, for which there was almost no evidence whatsoever, all the evidence had been manufactured through these falsified PCR tests and so on, or the way the figures were being quoted, the way the figures were being, or deaths were being attributed to COVID-19. On the justification of this manufactured health crisis, our rights and freedoms under human rights law were being almost entirely removed. Our rights of movement, of association, and increasingly our rights of freedom of conscience and expression as well, which is being ratcheted up even further at the moment. So it seemed to me that the regulations of biosecurity were making our health status the object of a targeted political strategy. And that was going on around the world. So the next term I want to talk about really is this term totalitarianism. What we've seen as the regulations of biosecurity have been temporarily revoked to a certain extent, certainly revoked by the government, although private companies, including the NHS, airlines, various transportation companies, impose requirements to be masked or to be injected and so on and so forth. So they haven't completely been revoked. They've simply been sort of siphoned into the private sphere. What's replaced them is this huge wave of new technologies and programs of biosecurity, which often don't have any immediate association, a lot of them, to health, but are about this realm of biosecurity, about controlling, monitoring, managing our biological selves, our bodies, where we can go, what we can do, and therefore controlling us as political subjects, erasing our political life by controlling our biological life. I imagine you all know what these are, but let's just go through them very quickly. The obvious one, and the one which is imminent, and which is in a way the gateway to all the others, is of course the digital ID program system. It was almost implemented on the basis of what we call vaccine passports, didn't we? Everyone was kind of threatening to implement them. Now they're being implemented in various other ways. They're being, for instance, pushed on the sense that with the immigration kind of frenzy that's going on at the moment, this kind of very carefully calculated fear of immigration. The Labour Party is sort of saying, well, we have to introduce this so we can't have illegal immigrants making illegal claims on benefits and so on and so forth. I imagine that when we go to war with the Ukraine, at the back of a very big long coalition led by the US, if that happens, and I think it will, we will be put on a war footing, if you like, and I imagine digital ID will come in that way. There's lots of different ways that digital ID can be implemented, but it is definitely the gateway technology to everything else. There are other ones like, for instance, universal basic income. It's pretty well known that there's a huge process of reskilling and redeploying of the workforce of particularly Western societies. A lot of people, a lot of economists macroeconomists are predicting that particularly the white-collar workers are going to be enormously affected by the new technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, and therefore have to train, retrain into new trades or new jobs. And a universal basic income is one of the ways in which that can be implemented, or through that. We've already got a system of social credit, which is very much modeled on that in China, which is not merely about controlling, as we've seen under the lockdowns there, the individual. It is also about regulating and monitoring and controlling companies. Sustainable Development Goals, the UN program, it's UN fronted, if you like, is a form of social credit. It's a way in which individuals and companies are given a social credit rating based on their compliance, not only with the laws of the individual country, but with the behavioral norms of the state. And these can be established through things like our online browsing records, search and purchase histories, and so on and so forth. Obviously, facial recognition has been around for a long time, which can identify us as being not compliant with regulations and so on and so forth. The important thing is, I think, that all these are being implemented outside of any democratic process. I think most British citizens are not aware of them. They might have heard of digital ID. They're beginning to hear of central bank digital currency. They certainly haven't been consulted on it. They certainly haven't voted on it. The government doesn't have any mandate for them. They're being implemented by global technocracies composed largely of the CEOs of international corporations, or banks, central banks, and so on and so forth, with bureaucratic representatives of governments. Take someone like, what's her name, Friedman from Canada, who's the what is she? She's the finance minister, isn't she? Who also sits on the board of trustees for the World Economic Forum. Smart cities, which is a World Economic Forum concept, and which is already being implemented in this country through 15-minute cities, and which of course is going to be regulated, monitored, and controlled through not just CCTV cameras, but the kind of the artificial intelligence technology we've got. You got things like the Internet of Bodies, which I think less people have heard about, which can have things like a quantum dot die, which is delivered with a vaccine. You can have a microprocessor storing encrypted data implanted under the skin, allowing contactless payments. You have smartphone apps that tracks your individual carbon footprint to monitor and control our consumption, or a microchip planted in our brain to augment reality. Now, no doubt you've heard of all these, and they've probably all been dismissed as conspiracy theories. They're not. They've all been announced, are already being used as new technology, mostly by people who've attended the World Economic Forum. You've got the Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness and Response Treaty, which is going to allow the World Health Organization, which is a private company, which is funded and lobbied by not only Western countries, but particularly by global corporations, is going to accord itself, or be accorded by our governments, with legislative power over our human rights in our own countries. You've got Sustainable Development Goals, which maybe we can talk about those later because it's a big issue. And we've got most immediately, the thing that I'm kind of writing about at the moment, which is the next big thing coming along. We've got central bank digital currency, which really is the cage which is going to contain us all. So I think it's important, though, that technologies themselves are neither good nor bad. It's how they're implemented. It's the programs that they're a part of. And when someone sort of says, well, CBDC, central bank digital currency, is about the fading out of paper money, it's going to be more environmentally sustainable, it's going to combat financial crime, and it's all part of progress and blah, 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 blah. That may be believable if you look at CBDC in isolation, but it's not. Digital ID, all these programs, all these technologies are interlinked with each other. And we can only understand how they're going to be used by the architects of this totalitarian system of monitoring, surveillance, and control if we understand how they work together. How much time have I got? A little bit longer. I think, therefore, when we talk of totalitarianism, there is no totalitarianism of technology or even of political programs or the implementation of that technology. the key aspect of totalitarianism is the ideological aspect of it, I think. I can't go into this too much, but I do in my book. I look at Hannah Arendt, the German political theorist, who was herself an escapee from the Third Reich, who wrote a wonderful book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in the early 50s. And she breaks totalitarianism down into 4 key aspects. One of them is that there is an absolutely unassailable and unquestionable authority, which is higher than the leader. In our country, for instance, under Stalin, it was class. There were progressive classes and residual, if you're redundant classes, which allowed him to murder millions of kulaks. Under the Third Reich, it was, of course, was race. There were progressive races and degenerate races. With us, the absolute authority is science. We're all told to follow the science, whether it's Greta Thunberg or whoever it is talking about, you know, the health crisis. We're always told to follow the science as an unassailable, hypothesized truth, which of course is the opposite of what science is. The other thing she says is, I think the most important one, she talks about ideological thinking. For Arendt, ideological thinking is how you progress from a first premise, which is usually unexamined, like first premises already are. And from that, without actually having to think, people can deduce from that first premise down to the most authoritative and generally appalling conclusions. So you take a premise like the world is warming up, and the cause of that is CO2 emissions from man-made global warming. And from that, we're getting to the point where people will be locked into 15-minute cities. People will be stopped from eating meat. People will be only allowed to fly, if you like, on planes a certain amount of times of year. That, well, you know, the kind of things that were being proposed on the back of that. It seems to me that what we've got at the moment, we had it under COVID, we've still got it now. We've got it under the environmental crisis. We're also getting it with the Ukraine crisis, when we are about to go to war on completely spurious and totally unbelievable justification, even more so than the Iraq war, is a form of ideological thinking. The last aspect I think about the ideology of totalitarianism is that it doesn't come from top down. That's tyranny, that's dictatorship. Totalitarianism is when everyone brings themselves into line with the new ideology. One of the things I write about a lot in my book is the ideology of woke, which I believe to be the emergent and soon to be dominant ideology of Western capitalism. And I don't think it's a joke at all. I think it is a fascist ideology. And we can talk about that later. Okay, the last thing is, I keep talking about this in terms of capitalism. I've never thought, and I don't at all now, that this is about a health crisis. I think what's going on is a revolution in particularly Western capitalism, which obviously dominates the globe, but it isn't the whole globe itself. And the new term used very openly by the World Economic Forum, which seems to have become the sort of the think tank for Western capitalism. It announces things, and then the countries and the companies which are its partners implement them. But it also acts as a kind of a propaganda arm, kind of to justify and to accommodate and to habituate us to this revolution in capitalism. The term they use, of course, is stakeholder capitalism. In my view, stakeholder capitalism is fascism for the 21st century. State capitalism is what we've seen with what I've just talked about the implementation of these programs, these technologies, and these ideologies. They are coming not from, the nation state is no longer the primary political model, if you like, under which we live in the West anymore. I mean, who voted for our prime minister? You know, so Italy has long had a kind of technocratic form of governance. The UK, we haven't. Quite proud of our democracy, flawed as it is, and the fact it's only run by 2 parties who are now exactly the same. But we've now got a technocratic form of governance, but it's only implementing programs, ideologies, political policies, which are quite openly being formed elsewhere. As we speak, in, where is it? Is it in Dubai? I think they're holding a world government, what's it called? World Government Summit, I think, in which our old friend Klaus Schwab has just announced, he's talked about all these new technologies that I've mentioned. And he says very openly, the people or the country the companies who master them will become masters of the world. I listen to these people because everything they say happens. When they talk about 15-minute cities, a few hours later, or a few months later, the councils of the UK are implementing them. And yet we didn't vote for them. They are in contradiction of our human rights. And yet somehow our human rights, the laws of the UK, as in every other Western country, have simply been discarded and ignored. And the forces that we'd expect to defend those rights, the law, the police, our representatives in government, are doing the absolute opposite. They are imposing policies, technologies, ideologies, which don't come from us. And that's, I think, a fascist model of governance, a technocratic form of governance. And it's quite clear should be clear, that the stakeholders in stakeholder capitalism are primarily immensely powerful and immensely wealthy international companies like BlackRock, like Vanguard Group, like State Street, and so on. The recent declaration or announcement by Zelensky, that the 100 billion that the West has invested or pumped into his country in 2022 is going to be coordinated by BlackRock, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs, should make it very, very clear not only what the reason is behind this kind of manufactured geopolitical crisis, and perhaps who's going to benefit from it, but who is calling the shots. And it is no longer the governments of the nation states of the West. So we've moved to a completely different model of governance, I think, which is a global government, and it's a technocratic one, and it's completely outside of any democratic process of election or accountability. And because of that, all these programs and technologies which are being forced upon us are bringing about a fundamental shift in the relationship between the ruled and their rulers and how we hold them to account. And it's completely rewriting the social contract that we've got with the state. How many time is that? That's about half an hour. How do we fight back about this? How do we combat it and resist it? Maybe should we leave that for the sort of the conversation? Yeah, so that's a very quick summary of some of the key points that my book tries to demonstrate. And Pete told me afterwards that few of you don't like the terms I'm using, so I'm very interested to hear if you come back at me with that, and we can kind of have a discussion about those terms or about what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for that inspired and very lucid introduction to your book. If people would like to raise a digital hand, I'm sure there'll be lots of points people want to pick up on. I was looking actually to ask you to say a little bit more. You mentioned Extinction Rebellion a few times, and I know some of our people have perhaps in the past been more involved in Extinction Rebellion, but you actually, to quote you, you're saying Black Lives Matter, Momentum, Extinction Rebellion, and now the masked up advocates of the global biosecurity state. These are all pro-capitalist movements hostile to the working class and directly, if not openly, opposed to socialism.
Yeah.
It's by their principles that the left has operated for some time in the UK, as in all the former neoliberal democracies. I'm also interested in a lot of my friends who traditionally have been perhaps called progressive or left-wing activists have been, in some ways, the ones who've been most compliant with the whole authoritarian lockdown steps. So perhaps you could just talk a bit more about those threads, and then we'll come on to some more questions.
Yeah, I don't know what the political tenor of your group is. I mean, what do these terms mean anymore? But one of the questions which has become one of the most incomprehensible questions of phenomena that we're trying to ask is, how is it the left, not only in this country, and the left is a peculiar thing anyway, but across the Western world, has become the loudest advocate, the cheerleaders for the most authoritarian erasure of our human rights and for the greatest rise in the power of international corporations over nation states. It seems to be incomprehensible that the left could be so incredibly stupid. I've written about, and continues to be, none of us really knew what was going on in April 2020. A lot more of us did within 6 months, more still in a year. But it's been 3 years now, and the left is still refusing to confront what is happening in the world. It's so obsessed with displacement activities like pronouns and all this sort of stuff. But it's more than that. It's actually collaborating. It's no longer just the sort of the pom-pom girls. It is collaborating in this takeover. I've written a lot about it in my book in various different chapters because it is an incomprehensible thing, and it's the thing that I get asked most of all. I think the only answer that I can give, and which my work with my organization Architects of Social Housing, which we've been in existence for sort of 7-8 years now, told us a lot about the left. The left in this country is not socialist. What binds it together, all its different factions, the Labour Party, all the different kind of organizations, is the ideology of woke. That is what I think binds it together. And woke is the ideology of this new world order that is emerging.
Thank you.
Response, maybe.
Okay, let's go into some questions. Anna, you were first to have your hand up.
Just taking my hand.
You're very quiet, actually. Can you? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that any better? Hi, I was just concerned. I kind of agree with a lot of what you're saying and the sense of it, and you're obviously researched and experienced firsthand a lot of these things. I'm curious about your thoughts on climate change and whether you think that there is an urgent need to address the planetary boundaries and pollution and the misuse of resources that giant corporations choose sort of fairly willingly to make kind of fairly terrible decisions about when the majority of the planet doesn't get access to these resources, doesn't get to choose whether or not. So similar sort of problems occur around resources and the planetary boundaries as are, as in they are undemocratic decisions being made about the use of resources in a similar way to your concerns about digital platforms and things.
Yeah. I mean, oh, sorry. Am I on? Yeah. Yes, of course I'm very concerned about all those things. Before I started writing about, sorry, I've got a really bad echo on this. Before I started writing about this, our organization, what we primarily did is design, we're an architectural practice, is design alternatives to the demolition of council housing in London and across the UK, which had enormously negative effects. The key one for us was that it evicted these communities who were then dispersed and couldn't afford to come back. They couldn't even live in London, a lot of them. We also opposed it because the costs of doing so, the economic costs of demolishing buildings and rebuilding them, meant that what was built in its place was not council housing or social housing or even affordable housing, which is a misnomer, but primarily market sale homes going on sale for £500,000 each, which was not addressing, but actually making worse the housing, the housing crisis, the housing shortage in the capital and across the UK. But the other thing we did, and we'd spent a long time, because this seemed to have a more of a purchase on the opinions of politicians and other architects who didn't give a damn about the people living in these communities, was the environmental costs. And we discovered, we worked with a lot of environmental engineers, and we discovered something very, very important. And that is, if you demolish a council estate of, say, 2,000 people, that holds 2,000 people, and you build in its place passive house homes, that is homes whose, there's no such thing as a passive house home, but say it's thermal performance of those buildings because of the insulation, because they've got, roofs which attract solar light or something like this, all of that, you can build the most expensive passive house buildings in its place. It will never recoup the environmental cost of the demolition, which is not simply the demolition, that is, you know, the kind of the pollution that's, you know, listed. It is the total carbon environmental cost of demolishing and redeveloping the state is, first of all, you lose the embodied carbon in the building. That is, the carbon cost of actually building the original building is now waste. Okay, then you've got to demolish it, enormous pollution from that. Then you've got to transport it somewhere else. Then you've got to dispose of it. Then you've got to get a whole lot of new resources. You've got to manufacture them into new buildings. You've got to cart them there. You've got to construct them. We've written a lot about talking about the entire carbon cost of a cycle of new technology or new buildings or whatever. And what concerns me about what I call the environmental fundamentalists, which isn't just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion and all that. They're just activists. I'm talking about the environmental fundamentalists who look at the performance efficiency of wind turbines or of electric batteries which harbor the energy they produce, or of solar panels, or of, you know, all the other so-called sustainable technologies which are going to rescue us from, you know, the global warming and so on. And they deliberately don't look at this total cycle, which isn't only environmental, it's also social and political, because the imposition of these new technologies at the cost of the others also has to be accounted for as well. Yes, like any rational person, I think we use too much of the Earth's resources, which have got a limit on them, perhaps, that we produce too much pollution, that the distribution of energy and the theft of the resources of the world and its distribution across the world is a huge evil which should be corrected. What I'm concerned about is that environmental fundamentalism is a form of ideological thinking, in the sense that it takes a first premise, there is global warming and man-made CO emissions are causing it, and it deduces from that solutions, which are no solutions at all. Like most solutions to crises, and I know a lot about the housing crisis, every single piece of housing policy written into law or implemented in this country over the last 20 years or 10 years, say 20 years, has been designed to make the housing crisis worse, not better. And I've written for years and years about this. The policies which were imposed ostensibly to address the health crisis of the coronavirus made it infinitely worse. Whether that was lockdowns, whether that was driving people out of care homes, out of hospitals into care homes, whether that was injecting people with something which isn't a vaccine, whether it was withdrawing health care diagnosis for 68 million people for 2 years. This all took a crisis and made it many times worse. And what is happening on the justification of the environmental crisis is going to make it many times worse. We are monetizing nature. We are handing over the resources of the world, which are largely in the South, the global South, in countries which are being loaded with vast amounts of debt by the imposition of sustainable development goals in order to meet these goals. And then they're going to be, well, we can't pay this back, so we're going to move in and take over your entire country. You know, it's not by chance that we're, you know, the US, the UK, and other countries are investing in places like the Congo and the Amazon, because that's where the copper comes from, that's where the lithium comes from for these batteries, and so on and so forth. So I'm not for a moment saying there is no, I don't like the word crisis, because crisis always creates fear, creates panic, and it justifies people not thinking. We don't need any more demonstrations of that. We've had that over COVID, we've had it over the environment, we're having it over the war, we're having it absolutely everything. We need to start thinking about what's actually going on. And this model of governance, of global governance that I tried to describe in relation to the coronavirus crisis, is the one which is not going to address, it's going to make it many times worse. Sustainable Development Goals, environmental, social, governance criteria, Agenda 2030 are all designed to, well, to hand over the resources of the world to the international corporations who are setting those criteria, who are pushing the sustainable development goals. That's what I think.
Thank you. Ken, from the East Coast of the States.
Should I call you Simon or
Yes.
Mr. Elmer?
No, Simon would be lovely.
All right. Just so you know, I've known Mr. Lawrence from a long time from the international music community. And yes, I am a cheerleader, amateur, but okay, here we are. My perspective on this may be different because I am in the US, just outside of Washington, DC. I'm trying to figure out the thing about freedom. And yes, I do call it the environmental crisis because in this country, there is way too much, how do I describe it? Suburban sprawl and misuse of resources and waste, conspicuous consumption by those who can do it. Would I be considered an opponent of freedom because I would be perfectly happy to ban things like Hummers? You know what a Hummer is? Like a really awful SUV. Oh, you call them four-wheel drives.
Schwarzenegger's car, wasn't it?
It's what?
It was Arnold Schwarzenegger's car, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, and I suppose, and he's not the worst offender. I mean, it's, you know, trying to navigate this and trying to figure out the nature of freedom. You know, I come up with weird things like, I don't care if people run down the street naked, that's not going to hurt anything. But increase in the sales of Hummers and SUVs and oversized houses and all that sort of stuff, yes, that does cause damage. And I get to the point where I read so much of this stuff, I get frozen. I feel powerless. I am very much opposed to global capitalism as we know it. I really don't know what to do about that. The best we can get in this country appears to be the likes of Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, and they are not going to do anything to fundamentally change how our society works. I keep hearing news reports, oh, the gross national product is growing up. I'm not sure that's a good thing, because that may include the amount of thorium that is dug up from countries in Africa to power handheld devices, which as a seething eccentric, I don't own, yeah, I can be described as a seething eccentric. I don't own handheld devices. I don't drive, blah, blah, blah. So, and I will say also that January 6th, that incident over here, I do believe that we had become very close to what is traditionally defined as fascism. I don't think the danger has gone away. I think in this country and elsewhere, there is way too much short-sightedness, ignorance, stupidity, nationalism, and by those who choose to do it, greed and short-sightedness, greed, nationalism, ignorance, stupidity, power lust, that's it. Greed and power lust by those who engage in that activity. So it's really hard to navigate through all of this. I am now 71. I don't think I'm going to live to see significant improvements. It's hard to live with that. I do believe all our problems are global. Of course, I personally cannot solve those on myself. I do think what Pete has started with Campfire Convention in and of itself is a model of a different sort of behavior. And as Pete knows, I could go on and on and on. And the other members of our Sunday group who I see in the thing across the top here. So I'll stop there. And haven't read your book yet, but it's on Amazon. Yes, we can talk about Amazon, but all right, it's there.
You probably won't find it.
Yeah, plug your book.
Thanks, Ken. Claire.
Oh, can I respond to Ken just quickly?
Sure, yeah, of course.
I think the question of freedom, what is freedom, is a very, very interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I think this is the issue of the left, isn't it? I kind of believed in the state. I still believe in it. I don't know. But a state which is there to defend us against the predations of capital. That's what it's meant to do. Yeah. It's actually become now the administrator of capital, has been for a long time. And the balance, freedom is also, it's not an absolute concept. It's about a balance between individual freedom and collective. That's always been the case. But declaring that the entire country or countries have to be locked into their homes and will be arrested and beaten up by the police if they leave it for a respiratory disease, which is statistically exclusively a threat to elderly people who've got a comorbidity, that's an abuse of the power of the state. So putting that in terms of, the kind of the overriding thing of the sort of environmentalism, how do you reduce tar use? How do you reduce oil consumption? How do you reduce airline flights without resorting to authoritarian measures? Because we live under Western capitalism, because we live under finance capitalism, what we're having is the kind of the model of fines, isn't it? If you're rich enough, you'll be able to buy a car. If you're rich enough, you'll be able to guzzle all the oil you want. And if you're rich enough, you'll be able to eat meat and do all that sort of stuff. So what is being put forward as a model of collective responsibility for the earth, I mean, I'm telling you stuff you already know, is actually being used to increase the inequalities in the world around wealth, the radical and increasing disparity, inequality, wealth inequality in the world.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Claire.
Hi, Simon, and hi, everybody. I think everything you said, I kind of, I've been on the same page with for quite a long time. And the problem that I seem to see is that it's very difficult for people to envisage this bigger picture. And because essentially there's no one person that you can pin the sort of the direction of this whole thing on. And it's like this idea of the elites and who's actually managing disseminating essentially this ideology, and until we have a kind of clear picture of who is actually doing anything, I think it's quite a nebulous thing to kind of just be against this sort of like essentially shadowy group of people that haven't got names. So I think that's the first thing, is that we really need to actually know who's kind of orchestrating things. And basically also then understand how that's affecting things like the media, because obviously the media is incredibly powerful and people will tend to go with the flow if something's, coming across with the BBC or through, mainstream news, Reuters, all the news agencies. That sort of telling the narrative in one way, it's very difficult to break away from that and actually kind of form your own independent mindset. When there's that whole sort of blanket of information. And even talking to people who are more on the right-wing side, they seem to think, for example, that the elites are all socialists that are trying to take over the world with a communist, plan. So it's sort of in fighting between different elements of society, which is the media is sort of propagating this, this tendency towards the polarization, so nobody can get a clear picture really. And that's what I'm feeling at the moment, is the sort of main barrier to anybody really understanding what we're up against.
And that really, before Simon replies, that really ties in with a comment Kate has left, I think, in the chat. I'd love to bring her in actually to talk a bit more about distractions and pointing fingers, etc. I hope you'd be happy to come in and talk a bit about that, Kate. But Simon, over to you.
Yeah, one of the reasons I kind of insist now on using this word fascism is partly, it's obviously to warn the seriousness of what we're facing, but also to counter what you said, Claire, I think the absurdity, there's nothing funny about it, of calling this some sort of communist coup. Undoubtedly, lockdown, social credit systems, and the sort of the surveillance technology of the the People's Republic of China is definitely one of the models for this. But that doesn't mean that this is this is a communist takeover. I think my insistence on this global technocracy and the people who compose it as being representatives of some of the most powerful corporations in the world To call them communist is kind of ludicrous. I was very struck that before this, before the whole sort of COVID thing, in this country, if you wanted to delegitimate any criticism of the government, conspiracy theory wasn't such a big term then, was it? But what you called them was left-wing loonies. And I think in the States, the US, you get called a goddamn communist or something like that, don't you? But you're always disparaged as being a member of the far left. But suddenly, when this all came along, anyone who questioned the government was called a right-wing conspiracy theorist. And I think this has encouraged a lot of people, particularly from the, I don't like labels, I'm just using this as a kind of a shorthand, like the libertarian right, if you like, who have rejected this, I guess, primarily on its destruction of their businesses and their individual freedoms, have been very quick and still resilient in describing this as some sort of slide into socialism or communism or something like that. And I think that is a deliberate misdescription, that's the right word, misrepresentation of what is going on, but who is responsible for it. In my book, I write about when I'm drawing parallels or learning lessons from historical fascism. So the political economy of the merger between business, of corporations and state authority, of the use of fear as a political tool, of the abjection and ostracization, that's a word, of a certain group of society, whether it's Jews or communists or now. I mean, we've had it with, the terrorist and the Muslim for many years, but now it's, it's the unvaccinated and so on. All these have got very immediate parallels with the way that fascism worked. But what we didn't have was a leader. As Claire said, we don't have this sort of identifiable sort of figure. We kind of know who they are. We know it's Bill Gates. We know it's Larry Fink. We know it's Augustin Carstens. We know it's these kind of sort of figures. But the way that this technocracy is working is not around an individual figure. The one that we've been given is Klaus Schwab, who is not a person of, I think, I don't know, it's hard to know who he exactly is, but he seems to be a kind of a comedy villain. But I was thinking recently that a figure has emerged who is very much like the leaders, the Führers, the Duces, the Caudillos of historical fascism, and that is Zelensky himself. I was very struck that he always walks around in this military uniform, even some kind of a designer version of a military uniform, even though himself, he was never in the army. He never even did military training. He's become this sort of ludicrous, laughable, faux military figure who was kind of carted around the world to perform to the legislatures of Western capitalism. And I don't know if he actually, do people actually believe that he's some sort of hero? But he seems to be playing this role of a kind of a leader, a fascist leader who adopts this ridiculous way of speaking, walks around and is a kind of a laughable figure, which at the time we laughed at Hitler, we laughed at Mussolini, we laughed at Franco, and none of those people were funny at all. I don't know why exactly he's been lifted. And someone said that he's the Greta Thunberg of the Ukraine in a way, but he's being used, and I imagine he's getting very rich out of it. Maybe he's being used as a patsy in a way, as someone to focus someone for people to focus their anger and hatred on. Whereas the real people, Bill Gates is going to be sliding into this country, this week to have another little chat with Rishi Sunak. Last thing about what you said, Claire, about the media, it is interesting that there's an enormous amount of anger directed at the pharmaceutical industry, directed at places like the WEF or the WHO, at our governments. The media seem to have got away with it. There's a kind of a generalized anger at the lies they told. But I can't remember the last time I heard the word Murdoch. Do you? Or any of the other kind of leaders of Fox News, or the people who've been sort of controlling this narrative, this extraordinary hegemony between the West, the press of the West, which we never saw even in the Iraq War. I've never seen anything like this kind of collusion between the press of Western capitalism. So I've just been watching some programs from Dennis Potter, from back in the was it the early 90s, and his loathing of Murdoch and how much we identified the lies of the Iraq War and stuff and the Tony Blair government with Murdoch. Those two are kind of, you know, collaborators. And yet at the moment, the media, there is no sort of figure for that. So yeah, I guess in a way, it's hard to call for revenge or identify a group responsible for this if they keep throwing forward false figures for us to kind of loathe. You know, you should remember that Hitler and Mussolini and Franco were all funded and supported by the industrialists and landowners of Western capitalism. We put them there, the same way we put Zelensky there.
Thanks, Simon. Just to pick up on Nick Boyce's comment, I imagine he's getting very rich from it, referring to Zelensky. Got any evidence for that, Simon? He's asking.
That's all in offshore accounts, isn't it? I'm sure it'll come out. You should ask someone who works in the City of London. We're the one who clean all the money, aren't we?
Yeah.
About 100 billion about 100 billion, no, what is it? 100 billion goes through the City of London every year. If you look at the reports by Transparency International, they've just released an extremely good report, very long book-length report on where the dirty money comes from that gets cleaned in the City of London. And the two main primary countries where that money comes from, you won't be surprised to know, is Russia and Ukraine.
Thanks, Simon. Simon Y, you've had your hand up for a while.
Gotcha. Yes. Yeah, there's a few things I'm a bit bothered about from what you've been saying, Simon. You've mentioned capitalism is behind all these evils, which that's the sort of thread I seem to be getting from this. But when it comes to this, I'll start with the pandemic. I'm just trying to picture there was this desperation to get vaccines into people's arms. That may have been a political one, but surely it was the scientists who were driving a lot of this. And people have said, yeah, it would have been the old people who have, or the people who are vulnerable who would have keeled over from this. I'm just trying to picture what would have happened if someone had got up at the beginning, if it was Boris with his little, you know, red and yellow stripy lectern in front of him, and said, well, okay, it's going to take 5 years to develop a vaccine and have it properly tested to make sure there aren't any side effects and all the rest of it. And we know this is a COVID, it's a respiratory disease. It's going to be people who are vulnerable who are going to go. So let's just do our best and not panic. And yeah, if you're going to, people are going to die from it. So we just have to live with that. If that's not an oxymoron. I just wondered, people keep saying this, that what was the alternative? If there wasn't this push for jab, what was the alternative? About, you know, that connection. And that's with biosecurity and all the rest of it. Was it really the pharma companies pushing it, or was it the scientists and the politicians who were up there under pressure to do something? I'm not saying that what they did was right, but I think we need to perhaps step back to the beginning of that. The other thing you talked about was woke being capitalist. I'm sure there are lots of, I'm thinking particularly of young people who are very woke. I wouldn't call them capitalists. I mean, again, I don't understand that. And the final thing for me is that you talked about the left being again influenced by business in being totalitarian, but doesn't that come from perhaps you said something about yeah, the left, I think it was that they're getting into this fascism idea about control of society, but isn't communism in the model, the Chinese model and the early Russian model, isn't that total control about, you know, you've got command economy?
Yeah.
I'm thinking, doesn't that come from that direction? Mm-hmm. And finally, did capitalism really start the Russian invasion to Ukraine? I mean, it may have been involved in, yeah, it's a great testing ground for Western weapons. My goodness me, you know, you've got the anti-tank missiles and your drones and this and that stuff. And hey, you want to try it out on a Russian tank? Whoopee. There is that. The Iranians are doing the same thing the other way. I don't know how should the West's response have been to Russian invading Ukraine? Should we just say, okay, nothing to do with us, They're the Russians. It's Ukraine anyway, so why should we bother? All right, there's a lot of stuff there.
That's a lot to answer. I'll take a big breath and do my best. Okay, first of all, roundabout way of having to go answering this. Every time not every time, but a lot of the times when people say the title of my book or I make a comment about it, people say, no, fascism is nationalism. It's a leader. It's a hatred of outsiders. It's military. It's blah blah blah. It's all these sort of things. That was an ideology. That's those sort of ideas which were common to a lot of countries and a lot of different governments at the time in the 20s and 30s. Most obviously in somewhere like the Soviet Union, which had a kind of a military, blah 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 stuff like that. I think I always find it amusing that people sort of talk about capitalism as this sort of fixed thing. I think a lot of people have this idea that capitalism is about competition, about free trade, about creating quality through competition, and these ideas of capitalism, which if they ever existed, was in a small German town back in the 17th century. Capitalism changes all the time. I think the capitalism we've got emerging now, out of the neoliberal revolution, which has kind of dominated the West since the last 50 years, is something very, very, very different. It's a form of finance capitalism, but it's driven by a hyper authoritarian state kind of a model. It's not completely, but it's unrecognizable from the capitalism of the post-war period in Europe and the US, which kind of neoliberalism, the liberalism, sent into history. So capitalism isn't one thing. The kind of capitalism, the reason I'm saying that this is caused by a revolution in capitalism is precisely that we're going into a new form of capitalism. The kind of the values of multiculturalism, of the free movement of people between countries, of all these kind of values which dominated neoliberal capitalism have now almost gone reversed, haven't they? The advocates of biosecurity don't want people to move around. They think freedom is about locking down, etc., etc., etc. So I do think this is driven by capitalism. What on earth else is driving it? There's no socialist country in the world outside of Cuba, perhaps. China is a form of state capitalism as well. I don't think China is the model that we're following. I think we're too different from them. But things like sustainable development goals are a form of social credit system. So we are learning a lot from them. I think the point is not to say whether this is capitalist or communist or socialist, but to understand what mutations, what revolutions in capitalism are happening at the moment, and to understand how these new values, these new relationships that it's bringing in, these new ideologies are being created to accommodate this fundamental revolution, which is happening in Western capitalism. That's a bit of a preamble, but I'm not sure what you mean by the scientists driving this. The scientists are.
I'm thinking specifically when COVID, when the lockdown was about to start, and Johnson and the other lot were up there all parading. They didn't all decide themselves, hey, let's have a lockdown because it's going to do a disaster. Who was whiskering in their ear?
Well, they went to.
Who was telling them what?
I mean, originally Boris Johnson was for staying open, wasn't he? And he was kind of slaughtered by the media, by the press, by and then he went in and got what's his name? What's his name suddenly? The
Chris Whitty.
Well,
Dominic Cummings.
Neil Ferguson.
Neil Ferguson, that's the name. You came out with that, probably the single most devastating document in the last 50 years, isn't it? And his absolutely ridiculous estimates of what was going to happen. And as I said before, everything we did made it much, much worse. Could we have gone back to the old Second World War thing and said, keep calm and carry on? These bloody mugs that people have got all over the place. Could we have said, tell you what, we're not going to panic. We're going to keep the hospitals open. We're going to allow people to exert their own judgment. If I've got a flu, I don't go round to see my girlfriend's father because he's of an age which it would be dangerous. He's dangerous to have flu. It's not dangerous to me. I'm not quite that old yet. These are sensible decisions. They were done in places like Sweden. Could we do that in this country? That's a judgment about where we are as a nation, isn't it? Perhaps we couldn't. We've lived for so long on virtue and terror, which is the title of my other book. We are creatures of virtue and terror, and we've been ruled that for so long, maybe we couldn't have done it. But what is certain, I think, is that we weren't given the chance. And what was done, lockdown, one of the biggest consequences of lockdown was not just the loss of our liberties and how that habituated us, accommodated us to where we are now, to accept things like 15-minute cities, which a few years ago we would have said was ridiculous. The worst thing of lockdown is that it withdrew medical care and diagnosis for 68 million people for 2 years. And it killed and is killing tens of thousands of UK citizens. That is a crime against humanity. And people like Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, and all the other cabal, who are not scientists, they are farmer-funded, tools, whatever you call them. They are guilty of that, in my opinion. Woke. God, you asked me a lot of things, Simon. Woke. Yeah. I didn't say woke was capitalist. I said woke was fascist. I think it's models of no platforming, of censorship as a default option to anyone you disagree with. Its demands for virtue signaling as a kind of a demonstration of compliance. Its penetration into our every aspect of our life. You know, the kind of the retraining programs that people have to go through. I don't remember voting for woke as my official ideology, and yet, you know, friends of mine who work at the Royal Academy, they have to go through these training programs. It's now written into our legislation. It's having incredible consequences. Whether you agree with those values or not, I certainly do not. Why are they being implemented in legislation? Why are they now policy? You didn't vote for them. It is fascist, if only in the way it's being enforced upon us, which is outside of any kind of democratic. I think generally in this country, it is the values of woke are not accepted, except by a tiny minority, most of who seem to live in North London. Young people, I've got a lot of sympathy for young people. They were born into austerity. They were raised on by their iPhones into identity politics, which is another appallingly regressive ideology, which focuses all on the individual. People are what they are rather than what they do. I'm not going to get into that. They're to be pitied, but they are being used. They are being used. Today in London, I've been steaming all day, and I'm not quite sure why, and I realized what it was. 4 kids sat down on Waterloo Bridge and blocked a line of traffic. I don't know where they were from, Just Stop Oil or whatever it was. The police sat around and looked at them. One guy tried to pull one of them away off the road, and he was in his rights to do so. They were causing public disorder. They were endangering themselves and other people. And a policeman assaulted him and arrested him while they continued to sit in the road. We can't expect 17-year-old kids to understand the complexities of Agenda 2030 and what's been going on. But it's not by chance that Greta Thunberg, as kind of a child, was chosen to front this. That's the way ideology works. It works not through rationality, but through virtue and fear. That's how it works. That's how they're being woke on. Can't remember what you said about the left of the totalitarian. I'll never.
I think you were saying something about the left becoming they're feeding into the capitalist system because of what their ideology. But I'm saying that their mindset of control is not through that. It's historically through things like communism, which wants command economy.
Yeah. I think. Well, I mean, the left in this country, I imagine across the West, in Canada, and in the US, in France, in Germany, it doesn't seem to me that socialism is anything more than a term that they use to describe other values like identity politics, like woke, like multiculturalism, which, in my opinion, are all neoliberal ideologies, although they're values of neoliberalism. They've got absolutely nothing to do with socialism, except that they are opposed to it, I think. Again, that's the way ideology works, isn't it? I don't think the left has got, I mean, of course, there are still some aspects, maybe your organization is, there are some left group, but by the term left, what binds it together and which has made it so complicit, not just compliant, complicit in what is going on, is that it's not socialist. Its values are quite different from that. The last thing, who started the Ukraine war? Sorry, Simon, the Ukraine war began in 2014, not in 2022.
Yeah.
It began when the US installed a puppet government. Take an analogy. Suppose Vladimir Putin put in a puppet government in Mexico. And he didn't just do that, but he had the whole of South America in a Axis alliance with him. And then they, what would the US have done? What would they have done? This is a manufactured crisis which has gone back a very, very long way away. The Zelensky government has banned workers' unions. It has banned independent media. It has banned opposition parties. It has promised to basically implement the Washington Consensus, which is a model of neoliberalization, which was used first in Chile and then Argentina under the junta, and has been used across the world, which requires that you implement these neoliberalization of your economic model, which of course is being managed by BlackRock now, not even doing it through the US government, as a condition of receiving loans. That's what's going on there. This is absolutely about capitalism, started that war. If you want to call capitalism the US empire. So that's what I feel about that.
Thanks, Simon. Just to quote Bob here, hey, Pete, Simon, will we be getting on to what we can do in response to this situation? Yes, definitely.
I got to go and have my dinner in a minute. It's very late. We're going to go on to how to save the world.
Yeah, so I'm going to go to Kate for one more question or comment, and then we'll get on to how we're going to save the world.
Yeah. Oh God, I'm steaming as well. I'm steaming because it's like how all this, the labels, the left, the right, the woke, the idea that any of there are, you know, we have a decent MP in our city, you know, it's like it's no one individual, do you know what I mean, around our political system and everything, and mixing up, like I really, that woke label really does my head in. I'll give you an example of a neighbour in our community centre who is scared and frightened, but tries and turns the neighbours against people who have who are asylum seekers who have come here and are contributing and everything. And we're running an organisation that is about bringing communities together across difference. And then the question is, oh, are you woke then? And my answer to that question is, oh, are we kind? Do we try and find bridges across difference? And I think it's like we're so stuck on the issues, like still like going, believing in this political system is actually a democracy. You know, we're still putting the power outside ourselves. We're researching stuff, we're being outraged about stuff, but we're not fucking doing anything about stuff. And it's like, how do we move beyond holding actions to actual structural differences, and we living our speak, you know, what we actually do something together. We find ways to connect across difference. We get underneath, you know, all these things of like, oh, you know, what is left, what is right, people being labelled and everything. What it is, it's distraction, and it's pitting us against each other, which enables fascism to happen. And I put in a link to a film that was made, a BBC documentary that I used to use when I was teaching psychology years ago, and it was fascinating, people's responses to watching that, because they could see. But it's the 5 steps to basically people exterminating their neighbours, to killing your neighbours. And the first thing is creating in groups and out groups. And, you know, I think linking back to what Bob was saying, what are the solutions and everything? I'm interested in how we move beyond this to actually start working together and living a different life together. And, you know, understanding that this is massive, it's huge to like fight and everything, but I just feel like it's yeah, how do we move beyond this? Do you know what I mean? It's, yeah, I don't know if that's very coherent, but it's a rant.
I think it was coherent, and I agree with what you're saying. I'm using woke as a shorthand. I think most people have an idea, some of what that means, but yes, it's the same. I mean, when I hear people now use the word left and right, it seems like, how can you even use those terms anymore? How can you, you know, I mean, people might argue about whether Labour under Starmer or anyone could still be called left. It seems to be completely irrelevant. Or as I said before, I think the division into talking about left and right, and the inability of people who identify or are identified as belonging to either to have any kind of communication with each other is only enabling the actually completely homogeneous force which they are fronting, which is towards this global government, which is a totalitarian system. And the left and right simply divides us from each other, as it has for a long time, but I've never seen it do that more and more. I will never call myself left again. I think it's a ludicrous thing. I mean, this week, someone in The Conservative Woman, which is not a paper I'd ever thought I'd appear in, reviewed my book, and they were kind of quite complimentary for a little bit. And then she kind of got to this bit. She said, "Oh, but then he blames it all on capitalism," and quotes Lenin and comes out with these sort of socialist diatribes. So very quickly, I mean, throughout the book, I'm quite careful as much as I can. I never call myself anything at all. I don't do that at all anyway, because it just gives a reason for someone to misunderstand you. Oh, well, you're that. Like you kind of said with your neighbour saying, "Oh, well, you woke then." It's a way to not engage with someone, to dismiss them, not to think. And I think the going back to our poor youth, the labels they've got for themselves, this huge list of labels is a way to divide people from each other, isn't it? Right down to their gender, their sexuality, and all things, let alone the politics. So I'm completely about getting over that. The point you make, I mean, recently I got approached by a political party with very good intentions who wanted me to stand as an MP or a councillor or something like that. And I was like, God, not on your Nelly. No way. I've got, from my work with architects of social housing, I've had a kind of an insight into the way that politics works in this country, not from the papers, but seeing how it works. And it is beyond compromised. I don't think it's got any hope I don't think it's a forum for change in this country at all. I think that change has got to happen and will only come from outside of it. The trouble is, 50 years of neoliberalism sort of dismantled so many of the sort of civic organizations, the unions, just that would have possibly become a forum for resistance to this, a kind of a legal footprint, somewhere to stand in which to oppose this. But instead, at the moment the unions are all on strike, great. Where were you in March 2020? Where were these unions? What they could have done and should have done then, but they didn't, because the unions have been so compromised for so long. And all the other organizations, the civic organizations, where were they? Where were the people looking after people? How could we let, what on earth were the hospitals doing, chucking elderly, vulnerable people out of their hospital into care homes and stuff, which killed tens of thousands of people. So the failure of the civic society in this country has been absolute, and we've got to begin all over again. And no offense, but I think we're all too old to ever see the victory of that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't start the fight back, because it's got to happen now. It's got to happen now, because in another generation, they won't even remember what a civic society is. I think those institutions will be not merely dismantled; they'll be absolutely non-existent. But I'm trying to say this in an encouraging way. We've got to stop thinking that Parliament and government is a force for change. It isn't. I don't know how much more we need to have that demonstrated. It's a nest of thieves and criminals. We've got to start building our own organizations and changing our own behaviors as well, I think, as well. I mean, that might be a good segue into saving the world.
Yeah, we've had a lot of talk within the Campfire Zooms about the change starting with us and then going from me to we and all that. I thought your comment, I think it was in the James Dellingpole interview, which actually introduced me to you in the first instance. You talked about we can still fight at the level of culture, education, propaganda, ideology, and ideas, which I thought was quite, it nailed it for me at that moment. But I'd also like to paste into the chat from your other recent article, a whole load of things we can actually do on a practical level. Never observe social distancing, never wear a mask, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole load of things there, which are practical ways we can actually take action ourselves. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit about this you were talking the panel discussion I did with Abir, which was probably the best one I did so far. It was very, very good. There was a real sort of agreement amongst us about what we were facing and what we can do. And when it came to you know, the $100 million question, how can we oppose this? A beer head who compared the whole thing sort of said, can we break it down into individual, collective, and societal? And I thought that was a useful way to think about it. I think I've been doing that in my kind of early articles, collected in books like this, where, because, you know, everyone was asking me, what do we do about this? Asking each other. The individual things we can do are non-compliance, which I guess we all know by now, you know, to you know, don't download the apps, you know, just say no to everything. That's very difficult, but I think one of the important things about individual non-compliance is that it's never individual. When you don't comply, you usually do it in a social setting and other people can see it. I mean, give you a ridiculous little example. Every time I go into a supermarket, I take my hat off and put it over the camera. It doesn't really matter because they film me a million times, but everyone else in that queue and everyone else doing the same will go, oh yeah, that's right, they're filming my face. It's a silly little example, but individual non-compliance is a show of non-compliance. And, you know, the statue of Melissa, the suffragette in Parliament Square says, you know, courage calls to courage. We've been cowards for a very, very long time, I think, in the West, in this country in particular. And I think we need to find our courage. And that comes from individuals standing up and saying, no, I'm not going to comply. So I think individual compliance is not useless. People say, well, okay, you're not going to download the app. You're not going to use a smartphone. You're not going to get digital ID, but everyone else is going to do it. But it's not that, because you demonstrate, you also draw attention to it. You know, the other day I was in a pub and we started talking about CBDC with this guy, and he was a trader in the city. And he said, and I said, what about the programming potential within? He said, they're not going to do that. And I said, you saw what they did in Canada when they turned off people's bank accounts for sponsoring the, you know, the Freedom Convoy. And he said, yeah, that's the point, isn't it? So even people who should know better, should know that CBDC is going to become a kind of an ultimate source of control. You have to tell them, and you can do that through individual non-compliance. We don't need to go through them all. We know what they are. They're getting longer and longer, aren't they? The kind of the list of things to say no to. The collective ones are sort of civil disobedience, aren't they? When you get together and you do stuff. You know, I always get asked by people, should I sign a petition? Should I go on a stand by the road on Saturday holding up boards saying digital ID is a form of social control? I think all those things are very good. And I think they do, again, they're not simply about what effect, what impact. You know, we kind of live in this world when they go, what's the purpose of doing that? We had that all the time with marches, you know, during the anti-lockdown, the anti-gene therapy mandates. I imagine some of you went on those marches. I think most people found them kind of extraordinary. You know, James Delingpole called it the Garden of Eden, and it was in a way. I've been on a lot of marches in my life, and I've never seen anything like it. There was no violence. It was it looked after itself. There was no security there. And what it did is it gave strength to the people engaging in civil disobedience. I'm very, very lucky. My partner and I kind of agree on all this, but I met a lot of people whose families have been split in half, totally, between husband and wife, generations and so on, because they didn't agree on this. And they found strength through participating in collective acts of civil disobedience. So again, it's not just, well, what impact did this have? What's the point of going on a march with 1 million people marching through London if the press dismisses as 100 right-wing conspiracy theorists? Parliament won't even talk about us, and the government issues new laws, you know, to ban us from protesting, to ban us from striking, to make, you know, vaccine mandates mandatory and all that. What's the point? Well, it supports the other people as well, and I think that is very, very important. Just to reiterate what I said to, sorry, was it Claire, wasn't it? This isn't going to come from Parliament. It's only going to come from us. And models of collective civil disobedience are the beginning of, you know, that other model of society, is community. Giorgio Agamben, when he says, when he talks, you know, at the end of my book, you might have seen this. The last book is called Humanity. The last chapter is called Humanity in Dark Times, and I talk about the politics of friendship. It's different from the politics of solidarity. You know, on the left, we always go in solidarity. Hannah Arendt says that the fraternity, which has been the ultimate value of the left, or revolutions, if you like, since the French Revolution. She says, when that particular crisis is over, that fraternity dissolves like that. I think we saw a lot of that when the regulations were lifted in March 2022. Suddenly, all the marches stopped. Everyone wanted to go back to sleep. Everyone was like, God, thank God that's over. We've seen it a lot in the work we do with ASH, with Architects for Social Housing. We kind of fight for years with council estate residents who suddenly go from being quiet people when they're threatened with losing their homes, their family, sometimes generations of people living in this council estate. They become enormously politicized and radicalized. But once their homes are saved, they disappear again. And what Agamben says and what Hannah Arendt says, because she writes, there's a presentation she gave about the politics of friendship, is that it's different from fraternity. And I think the politics of friendship is a very important one. Just very briefly, what she says is, the way we see friendship nowadays is an intimate space in which we share personal details about ourselves and therefore escape our alienation from the world out there. And she contrasts this with the role of friendship in ancient Greece. Like most philosophers, they always go back to ancient Greece. In Athens, ancient Athens, friendship was the condition of the success, functioning success of the polis, of the city-state. Under lockdown and continuing to this day, we have been banned, friendship has been banned. I don't mean simply physically, we've been banned from seeing each other. We engage in Zoom meetings. We're told to cover our faces up. We're told that people around us are a threat to our life. We're told not to visit our parents or grandparents, not to go to hospital when someone's sick. We've been separated from each other. A lot of this technology is about doing that. But we've also been banned from discussing these absolutely fundamental and revolutionary changes in our society. We can't even discuss it, because to do so, this goes back to the biosecurity thing, if you question authority, you're endangering lives. So I think reclaiming the space of friendship, the politics of friendship, is one of the ways we can understand how to build communities which then become a model of society. That's a long, long process, but if we're looking for first steps, that's the sort of answer I'd come up with. I also think, last thing I'm going to say, I'll shut in a second. If someone says to you, how can we overthrow this? And you put on your hat, your Lenin hat, and you say, well, comrade, we need to overthrow world capitalism and bring about a socialist paradise. All that's going to do is make people think, I can't do anything at all, because it's such a big answer to this vast threat that we've got. So I think we need smaller answers. And you can say, you can do this. And then people can say, okay, I can do that. I can't overthrow world capitalism, but I can start talking to my neighbors. I can start not complying. I can start engaging in collective acts of civil disobedience. Any form of socialist model, communist model, whatever you want to call it, any society based on justice and equality has to have a politicized populace. The reason we're in such a bloody mess is that we have been depoliticized. Nobody engages in politics. And I don't mean parliamentary politics, I mean in their community, in the estate they live on. They don't decide what their council is doing. Nobody votes in councils, nobody even knows what they're up to. We've been depoliticized, and that's allowed the criminals to come in and to take over the power of our lives. And what we're discovering now, what we've been confronted with, more blatantly we have been ever, certainly in my lifetime, is that power is not subject to our, it's not transparent. It's not interested in what we think. And we've suddenly woken up and realized, bloody hell, they don't give a damn about what we think anymore. And that's been a very long process of depoliticization. So any way to start opposing this and resisting it, building a better world, has to begin with that repoliticization. And that doesn't mean, I would say it literally doesn't mean voting for Labour or Tories or the Conservatives. It doesn't mean parliamentary politics. It means the politics of friendship. Okay, so that was a very long answer, but
thank you. I do like the Greek references as well in the last chapter, which I'd very much recommend to everyone. we have trailblazersmovement.org where we're getting a few ideas together, how we can get to grassroots. Every conversation can make a difference, sort of politics. And just to read a few of the comments, there have been some really interesting ones in the chat. Tamara mentioning the famous Buckminster Fuller quote, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." Anna saying, "We have to help younger people understand. I think many do, enabling younger people to practice solidarity." Claire saying, "Yes, we have to build resilient communities." Civil disobedience are holding actions of what is. Marches at best are good for solidarity, but doesn't change anything anymore, says Kate, who also says curiosity and compassion, building bridges, every conversation an opportunity to connect. Ebby says collective disobedience creates awareness. We get stronger and stand up. Never give in and say no. Do not comply. They can't lock up everyone. Compliance allows the tyranny to continue. Anything you want to say in conclusion, Simon? Do you want to mention a bit about your 2 books?
First of all, I agree with all of that. This is it. There's no one way to oppose this. I think our thinking that if we just vote whatever our party is into power, everything's going to be all right, is one of the big reasons we've got where we are, because we've abnegated our responsibility as citizens, and the horrible consequences of that has been demonstrated to us over the last 3 years. So I agree with all of this. There isn't one way. Everyone needs to find their own ways to do this. And I particularly agree our responsibility to our children, who we've handed over to apocalyptic ideologues and globalists, and the abuse of our children, I think is a great crime, which we need to start bloody reversing right now. But let's end on something good. First of all, thank you very much for having me. I was a little bit tired about this. I thought, God, did I really agree to talk to you at 8 o'clock in the evening? But I've enjoyed this very much. I hope you have. The Road to Fascism did fairly well, considering it's, we kind of sort of published this, my company's published this ourselves. And before that, it was prefaced by 18 months of articles, and I've made a selection from them, some of the ones which I think are kind of still important. Ones like, for instance, there's one called Lies, Damn Lies and Statistics, Manufacturing the Crisis. And it looks at the mortality statistics, and it shows pretty conclusively that what killed people in 2020 was the effects of lockdown, multiple effects of lockdown. Another one is called Qui Bono, the COVID-19 Conspiracy, which looks at the role of the accusation of conspiracy and tries to situate this within what it kind of claims is a revolution of Western capitalism. And there's 3 very long articles about the UK vaccination program, which ends on resistance, which is ways to resist it. Anyway, I put these all together, partly because you'll all be aware at the moment, a lot of people, journalists, politicians, and doctors are saying, we didn't know that lockdown, that experimental gene therapies, and all the other terrible things that they called for and shouted for, and wanted us and tried to silence us for opposing, would have the devastating effects they did. And I don't think many people, certainly people like us, believe them. But partly I wanted to publish these as a document that not just I, of course, but lots of people knew right from the start that this crisis had been manufactured, that the way we were responding to it was making it infinitely worse, and that it was a front, if you like, a cover, a cloak for what we've been talking about today. And I knew this very, very early on. Nobody who actually looked into this could possibly have any doubt that lockdown was going to be devastating, and its effects are going to get much, much worse. So I published these. There's 2 volumes. One is called Virtue and Terror, which is volume 1. And volume 2 is called The New Normal. I'm having if you live in London, if you're unfortunate enough to live in London, I'm having a book launch on the 11th of March in one of my favorite pubs in Soho, upstairs in the William Blake Room. I'm doing it on the 11th of March because, as you'll remember, that's the 3rd anniversary of the World Health Organization declaring the pandemic. So I thought it was a good way to mark that. I think the perpetrators of these crimes need to be held to account. And that starts with us actually identifying them as for what they are. They weren't mistakes, they were crimes. And I think people need to be held accountable for that. I've also got an introductory essay in this, which is quite a long one, in which I try to bring, because this was these ended, I think, in October 2021. So I've tried to bring it up to where we are now, talking about the incredible state that this country is in and its government, to talk about how rapidly and seamlessly the restrictions of environmental fundamentalism have replaced the restrictions of COVID fundamentalism, if you like. I think fundamentalism is another term which I could talk about. That's a very, I think, important strain in what's going on, and also to talk about what's happening in Russia and what's happening in Ukraine. I think what happened to Russia after the dismantling of the Soviet Union, a lot of people are asking, how can the apparent, what seems to be the deliberate destruction of the small and medium-sized businesses and generally the economy of Western countries could possibly benefit from that? And I think what happened to the Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, with the rise of this oligarchical class, is what is happening in the West now. We're not going into Russia or to the Ukraine to save them from the oligarchs. We're going in to become the new oligarchs, I think. Anyway.
Thanks very much, Simon. And I'll be uploading the chat to the Campfire site. Of course, you'd be very welcome to join us there, where I'm sure the conversation will continue. So thanks very much for your time and your wisdom on that. And thanks for everyone for attending. And hopefully see many of you on Sunday for our Sunday morning Zoom. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks very much, Pete. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Amazing.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. See you all on Sunday.
Cheers, Simon. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Really good.
Thank you.
Really good.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you. Nice chatting with you all.